Hello, I'm Earl Weinberg, and this is Book Circle Presents An Ever-Mounted Cavalry. Our friend Ivy is now at Upham, the town that hosts a cavalry base, in fact, a base now for two cavalries, one human, one centaur. And she is palling around with the youngest centaur on the base, young Gerald. Not far away, they heard shouting. Not excited shouting, but the loud announcing officers used for groups of underlings. "That's the general," Gerald said. "Ooh, he's on the archery range," and he began trotting. Ivy ran to keep up. The archery range was next to the track. It had recently been screened off from the track and the street by a whitewashed wooden fence, but the other two sides were open to the cavalry base. Gerald turned around the end of the fence. Ivy followed. She immediately saw why the archery range now needed more privacy. 8 naked men stood at attention in a row before General Fitzsimmons. The general, dappled gray and with long-horned mustaches and pointed beard, was in dress uniform, bright red jacket and vivid blue hat and saddle blanket, the latter bearing the fleur-de-lis and heraldic lions of the Grand Norman arms. He was shout-lecturing the naked men in Chenelaise. When he finished, the naked men chorused, "Eh, Senaire!" Ivy had heard that bit of Chenelaise many times lately. "Yes, sir." Fitzsimmons said one more thing and waited. Nothing happened. He gave a curt nod and raised a crossbow, the first Ivy had ever seen. He held out his hand. The only other person on the archery field was Dr. Blackholt, Miss Blackholt's uncle. Glossy black of hair, beard, and coat, he wore a white jacket and saddle blanket and carried a pouch rather like Gerald's. From this he took a short, thick rod and handed it to Fitzsimmons. Quickly, smoothly, Fitzsimmons fitted the quarrel into the crossbow and shot the man on the right end of the line. He fell over backward and swelled and melted all at once. In moments, he was a centaur. Fitzsimmons was already reloading. Now knowing what to expect, Ivy watched the next change closely and could see it was the same she had seen Lieutenant Fletcher go through, thereby sundering herself. She felt a bit sorry for the man at the left end of the line. Maybe he wasn't supposed to turn his head, but he had, and was watching one man after another warp and sprout and cease to be wholly human. When the 6th man fell over and became the 6th centaur, he began a panicked yelping and thrashed even more frantically than the others. The 5th centaur, who had just squirmed to an upright sitting position, grabbed a flailing hand and said something. Dr. Blackholt stared intently. General Fitzsimmons reloaded. Ivy heard a little grunt off to her right. She and Gerald were not the only ones watching. There were a handful of others, and the one standing nearest her was Lieutenant Fletcher. He nodded to her and flipped her an airy salute. "I didn't yell like that," Gerald remarked scornfully. "We can't all have good nerves," Fletcher answered him. In a few more seconds, there were no more men on the archery field, only centaurs. Dr. Blackholt moved in to talk with the panicker, who had stopped yelping but was still trembling and holding on to the hand of his fellow. General Fitzsimmons moved to the right end of the line and seemed to be talking with the other new centaurs he had made. Gerald nodded to himself, said, "I have to go. See you, Ivy," and trotted off. Ivy turned to Fletcher. "Did you go into fits the first time you put on the seaming cloth?" "No, but I can see why that fellow did. It is strange. The strangest thing that ever happened to me. And confusing." "What's it like?" Ivy asked, hoping for details. "That's part of why it's so strange and confusing. I can't tell you. In a way, it doesn't feel like anything. Instead, it changes how you do feeling. When you go to the cinema, you could see anything on the screen. But it would be a whole new thing if the screen itself started changing size and shape. So I can see why that fellow there was upset." Ivy spared a glance for the one who had panicked. He had managed to stand, and for the first time, on his 4 new legs, and was listening with humble nods to whatever Dr. Blackhole was saying to him. "But it doesn't hurt?" she asked. "Not at all." "Yes, it's strange, but there are ways it feels great. Suddenly you're big and strong, and tails are fun." He nodded at the new-minted centaur at the left end of the line, who was staring off into space while revolving his tail as if trying it out for a propeller. "And you," said Ivy, thinking out loud, "are the only one who knows what it's like to turn back." "Well, no. Brother Eugene knows, just from the opposite starting point. And Miss Blackholt's used the seaming cloth, too. She's true to her blood. She wasn't going to miss out on an opportunity for shape-changing like that. The no-girls rule doesn't apply with mere seamings, I gather. Her uncle's used it, too." He nodded toward Dr. Blackholt. "He invented it, after all. He's the only one, so far as I know, to have experienced both the seaming and the real transformation. But," he added meditatively, "I don't know you could say he knows what it's like." "What do you mean?" asked Ivy. "One of the strangest things about the change is the way it mucks about with your mind. If that hysterical fellow was tuned into that, it might be a good reason for his hysteria. For these few minutes he may still be able to remember what it felt like to have toes, but he'll have forgotten by the end of the day. Oh, he'll know that he used to have toes, but he won't be able to remember the feeling of it. Just as right now I can't remember what 4 legs and a tail felt like, though I do know a tail was fun." Ivy studied Lieutenant Fletcher. Average height, a bit thinnish, face pleasantly friendly and almost bland. A good face for a spy, it occurred to her, and just now a faraway look in his eyes. He looked quite inoffensively ordinary, and maybe he knew that, and maybe he didn't like it. And the Blackholt family need not be the only folk who yearned after strange experiences. He did not appear all that ordinary at the moment, though, looking quite snappy in a Vanguard dress uniform, a somewhat sinister black version of an ordinary soldier's uniform, with a flat, short-brimmed officer's hat. Vanguard. "Why are you here?" she asked. He raised his eyebrows. "Sorry, that sounded rude. I mean, I'm glad to see you, really, but you're not cavalry like Brother Eugene, or majory like Miss Blackholt." "Ah, well, I'm an expert witness, or as near to it as we can get at present, and a prime specimen." He waved at the myth figures on the archery field. "When Blackholt and Fitzsimmons aren't shooting magic arrows, they're debriefing me about every last little detail of my experiences with the seaming and with the Ubersoldaten." I hoped they were not making him remember his time hosting the Ubersoldat Ghost, but she didn't dare ask. Likewise with Miss Blackholt, Lieutenant Blackholt, too, when she isn't helping her uncle at the enchanting. Also Brother Eugene, when he isn't busy patching up young centaurs who are tripping over their new legs. And the Blackholts are always running various magical tests on me. That's where the specimen part comes in. Ivy followed his gaze back out to the archery field. The new centaurs were all standing now. Fitzsimmons barked a command, and they all came to attention and saluted. Fitzsimmons returned the salutes, then wheeled and paced away. Blackholt beckoned, and another centaur, black with white socks, cowboy hat, and a regular working jacket, came out and began giving them a shouty lecture Ivy could not hear. Drill sergeant or something like it? He was, she could tell, one of the glum ones, a victim of the Desalonian attack. He didn't look like he'd have much patience for the wonder and strangeness of their new condition. She became aware that Fletcher had turned his gaze back on her. "And because of my vast experience," he said in ironical tones, "they want me for something else. You may as well know now. You've had to fight them just as much as Brother Eugene, Miss Blackholt, or I. The Ahnenerbe knows that we know about their patchwork champions. Quickly, before they can act on that knowledge, we have to act on it. We are mounting an assault on the Black Forest." He nodded again at the 8 new centaurs trotting off after their instructor. "They won't be going because they're too new, and of course not Gerald. But but his family are, and Brother Eugene, and many others, including me, tomorrow. Ivy did not at all mind running errands. Back home, it had been an escape from boredom and, in part, from anxiety. Miss Blackholt had not had many errands for her in Oswick, but then she had been keeping secrets. Here she had more for Ivy to do, conveying messages and small packages, verifying that person A had reached place B or had supply C, running to the quartermaster's for this or that. Errands to the quartermaster's were interesting. There were two. A grizzled, middle-aged man for the standard cavalry, and a buckskin centaur, light brown with dark socks, for the new dedicated cavalry. Both tended to greet her with cautious stares, because she always came asking something for the mages. This meant deliveries that had to stay warded, or be found in the dark, or on one occasion not spoken about. Now, with the push on, she had no time to consider whether she liked it or not. And now it was no escape from anxiety, because both Lieutenant Fletcher and Brother Eugene were going. "I wish you weren't going," she blurted out to Brother Eugene while dropping off some boxes of enchanted bleed-stopping bandages. He was in his stall, which looked a lot like Miss Blackholt's garage, except that Miss Blackholt had provided more and thicker mattresses. It was now filled up with medical supplies, both mundane and magical. "I wish it too, in a way," he answered her, "but in another way I am eager to go. One wants to do one's part. One wants to feel I'm not too old to be of use. And I'm the only medic to have dissected a centaur, and the only medic to have become one. So I'm what we have for an expert." "Can I pray for you?" she asked it in another blurt. She had never asked this of anyone before and was not sure of the rules. Brother Eugene had been sitting on his meager-looking mat, going through lists on a clipboard. He now looked up, put the clipboard down, and opened his arms to her. As she moved in for the hug, he answered, "Well, of course, thank you, and I for you, because I know it's also hard to be left behind. There's a great, huge safety net of prayer going up around us here, now, and you can certainly be part of it. We can all pray." "Is there anything particular I should do?" "No. Prayer is the same on both sides of the sundering and in every world. We ask. We just ask. God will do what is best for us," he assured her, letting go of the hug, "though we can't help wondering how much the best will hurt." She kept an eye out for Lieutenant Fletcher, but didn't see him. She saw a great many other people, which was a bonus of being an errand runner. One group she saw for the first time in the frantic hours before departure were 4 young stallions, 3 dark brown bays and a black. She saw them 4 times that day, always just in passing, always in a tight group, always near General Fitzsimmons, but never talking to him, nor talking to each other or anyone else, or doing anything at all, just standing there. She wondered if they were Lord Whoever Elaine and his 3 sidekicks. That would make sense, she thought, that the general would keep an eye on them rather than, say, have one of them be found on the archery field with an arrow through his throat and no Fitzmichael anywhere in sight. Perhaps they had been given to one of the officers that were always coming over to confer with Fitzsimmons, and came and went with him. They looked grim. Late in the afternoon, Miss Blackholt's stream of errands for Ivy abruptly ended. "Come, Ivy," she said, "we will see them off." And she led the way through the maze of boxy buildings to Ufham's High Street. The sides of the street were becoming crowded with all manner of folk, but the street proper was filling up with men and horses and man-horses, lining up in columns. Ivy spotted Brother Eugene and Lieutenant Fletcher, and suddenly realized how important it was she seized the chance to say goodbye. "There they are!" she exclaimed, without saying whom she meant, and darted through the crowd, never hearing Miss Blackholt's exclamation. She collided with someone well before she got to the cavalry columns. "Oh, I beg your pardon!" she exclaimed on the rebound. Her victim was a tall, angular man with gray-white hair and a shaggy mustache. He wore a uniform, but it was baggy on him and a very pale gray, so that she wondered if he was a monk of the Order of St. Martin, like Brother Eugene. Like her, he staggered but did not fall. Another pale man reached out to steady him. Quite all right, her victim sputtered cheerfully. I'm so sorry. I was heading for my friends and I wasn't looking where I was going. Ah, then we're even. I wasn't looking where I was going either, and I was headed for them. He pointed down the street. A black-coated centaur in dress uniform and a woman in red were advancing toward them. A soldier's daughter from a city well supplied with transient soldiers, Ivy was used to checking for rank insignia and had quickly learned the Grand Norman ones. The centaur didn't have any she knew. Instead, on each shoulder, he wore a little embroidered crown. Oh. She tried to decide if the centaur's face, now bearded, matched the one she had seen in the newsreel. Is that Prince Hugh? She asked. The man nodded and waved to them. Behind her, she heard Miss Blackholt squeak, "Yes." As the pair closed in, Ivy took in more details. Hugh was trailed by men in various uniforms with regular short-billed hats, a guard perhaps. The woman next to him only came up to his shoulder, but that still made her very tall, taller than Ivy's father or Lieutenant Fletcher. She wore an officer's cap, tunic, and slacks, all in different shades of dark red. Her hair was an even darker red, and her lips were crimson, very vivid against a face so pale Ivy wondered if it were powdered. She wore a large black gun on one hip and a sword on the other. The sword's hilt and scabbard, along with her hands, glittered with gems, all reds and purples. Behind her walked another woman, even taller than she, similarly uniformed, but with no hat or weapons. "Oh my," Miss Blackholt breathed behind Ivy. "Ah, introductions," said the man in white. Ivy now noticed that he had no insignia. "You can call me Rayenro here, and this is my squire Kellebroch." The man who had steadied Rayenro here after the collision nodded silently at Ivy. He was a study in white. White uniform, platinum blonde hair, pale gray eyes, face as pale as the woman by Prince Hugh. Like the woman's attendant, he was big and hatless and weaponless. His expression was detached. "I'm Ivy Treadwell," she replied. She turned and verified Miss Blackholt was indeed there. "And this is Miss Claudine Blackholt. Miss Blackholt was wearing a severe green dress that was in fact her uniform. It had insignia on the shoulders. This reminded Ivy. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant Blackholt. She's my..." Hostess? Keeper? Guardian, Ivy tried, not at all sure it was a good choice. "Ah, another Blackholt in the Majory," said Rayenro here, spreading his mustache in a smile and shaking Miss Blackholt's hand. This had interrupted Miss Blackholt's beginning curtsy. "And here we are." He turned to greet the centaur prince. "Hugh, here's your top mage. Where are the others?" "Salted in with the cavalry, sir," answered Prince Hugh. 26, the woman in red added, clearly thinking the number small, of whom 6 actually know how to ride. The others are riding double, or what amounts to the same thing, on centaurs. Her gaze fell on Miss Blackholt. "Can you ride?" Miss Blackholt opened her mouth to speak, but Hugh cut in. "No, ma'am. She is our next court mage. We really can't spare her." The red lady looked up at him with raised eyebrows and no hint of a smile. Hugh's great height seemed no advantage. He met the gaze, though with an effort. "We've had enough succession problems. I'm sorry, ma'am. She stays." She gave a sharp little nod and turned to look over the forming lines. Meanwhile, in her mind, Ivy had been racing to keep up. The man in white had known who Miss Blackholt was all along, and he appeared to outrank the prince, as did the woman in red. They must be 2 of the top fairies backing Grand Normandy that Brother Eugene had mentioned, the White Errant and the Blood Lady, if Ivy remembered correctly. Ivy had a hat, a green beret with the majory insignia on it, to help identify her as running errands for a mage. She started to take it off. "Leave it on," Miss Blackholt muttered. "Would you care to ride now, ma'am?" asked the big woman attending the Blood Lady. Good idea, she replied. The big woman backed up, clearing a small space in the crowd, which seemed quite willing to give it. With a kind of twisting billow, as of a red flag unfurling, the woman expanded into a rearing horse. She came down on her forehooves quite smoothly, then presented her side to the Blood Lady. The change had not been quite as fast as that of the bee fairies, and Ivy had glimpsed the transformation of clothes into saddlecloth saddle and stirrups. The Blood Lady swung into the saddle and rode off toward the front of the forming lines. 26 battle mages, eh? Said Ray and Rohir, as if people had not been arguing and transforming. Well, I dare say it's more than the Germans have in the Schwarzwald. Nothing but their patchwork berserkers and the mad scientists who cobble them together, according to information received. And he looked to Miss Blackholt. Your friend recovered from auditing that ghost? He asked her. He appears to be, sir, she answered, and pointed into the line where Fletcher sat on a horse standing next to Brother Eugene. And plenty of elixir to keep everyone charged up? My uncle and I have been brewing it up as fast as we could, sir. Ah, I'm sure. And we aren't caught flat-footed the way we were when we had to drag you to Castellralp, the White Errant said to Prince Hugh. We'll have Vise to share out. Thank you very much, sir. 26. Well, we can do a lot with that, I'm sure. Kellebrock, he said, turning to his attendant. Kellebrock nodded deeply, backed up into the yielding crowd, and surprised Ivy not at all by blossoming into a white horse. Ray and Rohir nodded with equal cordiality to Prince, Mage, and Evacuee, hopped on his servant, and headed for the rear of the columns. Prince Hugh drew a step toward Miss Blackholt, glanced back at the merely mortal attendants trailing him, and asked quietly, Your Excellency, can you give us a little privacy? Miss Blackholt widened her eyes at this address, but then stared into the distance, and Ivy soon realized that the crowd noises around them had shifted into a muffled dithering sound, as if heard through a fan. Thank you, he said, and thank you both for your work in unmasking these Ubersoldaten. My work? Exclaimed Ivy. Your Majesty? Highness? The Centaur Prince smiled. I have heard that you were instrumental in discovering that if one shoots an Ubersoldat in the gut, the alchemical brew there digests him from the inside out. Very valuable information. He sobered. Ignorance kills. Did it strike you that Rayenro here was trying very hard to sound encouraging? I hope not, Your Highness, Miss Blackholt murmured. Hugh sighed, but then turned to Ivy. Miss Treadwell, I have read Lieutenant Fletcher's reports, so I know you were thrown into all our affairs without the least warning. I also know you readily agreed to cooperate, and of course that same night you fought the enemy with Brother Eugene. I'm very sorry you were put through this, and very grateful for how freely you have given your cooperation. Ivy felt herself blushing. She was being thanked by an actual prince, an enchanted one, moreover. She tried to rise to the occasion. I was glad to, sir. I was helping friends. And Brother Eugene said you're the allies England doesn't know it has. So there's that, too. Hugh smiled, then turned his attention to Miss Blackholt. Your Excellency, I only know you by report, but the report comes from your uncle, so I put much weight on it. What do you see as your job if this mission fails? Miss Blackholt stared open-mouthed at the prince. The muddled sounds around them started to clarify. Then she looked down silently. The background noise curdled again. The prince waited. I am to be the Queen's main advisor and agent in magical matters. That would remain true. I suppose I would be largely at work replacing lost magical talent, especially with an eye to war work. That could well be part of what is needed, much of it. But I ask that you start giving thought to how you could help my mother hold Grand Normandy together, keep it existing. Miss Blackholt looked alarmed. Ivy was feeling dread. If the mission failed, it meant Brother Eugene and Lieutenant Fletcher were likely dead, maybe worse. Sir, exclaimed Miss Blackhold, failure would be a catastrophe, but that bad? We took a body blow when we lost my father and brother. Then the idiot nobles fell to squabbling over the succession, another blow. And the squabbling led to this. He held out his arms and looked down at his body. By the way, it's a great relief that I can talk frankly with you about this. I was able to finesse this into looking like a gesture of strength. But if this mission fails, not only do we lose the infant dedicated cavalry, we lose much of the old cavalry and more of the majory and vanguard than I care to think about. Many nobles, many families and individuals among the commons may simply decide Grand Normandy is no longer a going concern, and by that decision make it no longer a going concern. They will hide among the unsundered or join other sundered groups. It is possible. Remember Valkyrstein. I'm sorry, Ivy whispered. What's Valkyrstein? Miss Blackwood answered, Valkyrstein was a small cryptic nation in Norway. It was destroyed in 1940 when the Nazis invaded. We think the Ahnenerbe was involved, Hugh said. Not every Valkyrsteiner was killed by any means, but the law speaker and the generals were, and about half of their wizard warriors, along with many regular soldiers. There weren't many. We are tiny, and they were much smaller than us. The remnants simply became ordinary Norwegians, well, ordinary sundered Norwegians, or fled. We have a few of their refugees among us. That is how we might go if this mission fails. And the Ahnenerbe, emboldened, could start infesting Europe and Britain with their Übersoldaten or whatever other tricks they have. He looked at Ivy. The sundering will not protect the unsundered from them, only hide how unnatural they are. The Ahnenerbe could not produce large numbers of them, but a small number could still be very demoralizing. So we must win, and win resoundingly. If we scrape through with great losses, Grand Normandy could still crumble from discouragement and lack of men and magic. We cannot take another body blow, or so I judge. They had been ambling down the street, Hugh gazing at the forming ranks, sometimes nodding to them as his bodyguards trailed behind, outside the privacy spell. Now he stopped to face Ivy. I suppose it might make little difference to you if a secret society of magic-using smugglers goes under, but for us it is home, and for me it is my life's work. No, no, sir, she answered. I've seen people lose their homes and their own folk. I have to care about it happening to Grand Normandy. And you're holding back those monsters. He laughed and whisked his tail. With our own monsters. Monstrous is as monstrous does, Ivy muttered. I think that's what my dad would say if he knew. Sir, said Miss Blackhold, if I may, do you have a sense of the strength of the enemy? Only a slight one, based on your own notes from Fletcher's debriefing and on the results from examination of the Übersoldat your bees captured. Ivy wondered how they had examined him, given the steps Lieutenant Fletcher had taken. She decided to ask much later. The Ahnenerbe monster makers told their agents nothing they did not need to know, but the agents had eyes and brains and made guesses we have learned. I can hope their numbers are not great yet, and I can hope that the ones sent to England were the cream of their crop. But of course we mustn't trust to that. Ivy, please keep quiet about this. Ivy reflected that her nightmare night with Brother Eugene had earned her a lot of trust from Hugh. Yes, sir. I swear by my name. Did she feel something? Almost as if her ears had gone a little stuffed? Did she feel just a little trapped? Well, she had promised. The three of them paced along for a minute. Then Hugh said, Where were you bound when you collided with Row here? I was going to say goodbye to Brother Eugene and Lieutenant Fletcher, sir. I saw them in the line back there. Then please continue. Miss Blackholt curtsied, and the crowd noise resumed. Ivy did her best to copy the curtsy and followed her back toward their friends. "I think he'd make a splendid king," she declared to Miss Blackhold. "Why can't you have a centaur king?" "I agree. In a way he is, I think. Remember, he and his mother proposed a joint monarchy. I think they are running one anyway, without the formality of titles." Titles. Oh. I forgot to call him Your Highness. I just said Sir. Sir is fine after the first Your Highness. I called him Sir, too. And why did I have to keep my hat on? Meeting royalty is like going to church. Men must take off their hats, women must put theirs on. Miss Blackholt was wearing a cloche hat that matched her uniform. Why? No idea. And we will see our sundered fighters off to the war next time.